Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
Hey.
So we are starting the personal storytelling in games panel. I'm so excited to be here with you today. There is, it seems like a little bit of a time delay, so I'm just double checking the chat. I think there might be a 6-second delay, but hopefully we can still engage with chat here. Yeah, so maybe we should start off by introducing ourselves, maybe in alphabetical order. Yeah. How's everyone feeling? Or maybe I should start off first to not put Gabby on the spot.
Yeah, I don't feel ready to figure out alphabets right now.
I had to do some math to figure out who was first.
Yeah, and it's like first name or
Right.
last name? Which one am I talking about? Okay, so I'll start us off. My name is Tanya Kan. I'm the developer for Solace State, and it is a 3D visual novel and engaging in ideas of civic engagement. You play as a hacker who goes to a surveillance society to try to find her friends again. And as you do so, you realize that the society has much more to offer, but also much more restraints on rights and all of these social pathos. So you're actually engaging with questions of intimacy as well as questions of changing society as a whole. So I direct that project. I work on some of the art and writing and some of the admin as well. And I'm so excited to have a chance to talk to some folks who I just adored their works for such a long time. So thank you so much for being part of this panel with me.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank
you. I can go next since Gabby apparently is higher in the alphabet. I did that math over like 20 seconds. My name is Gabby DaRienzo. I am a Toronto-based independent game developer and artist, probably best known for games like A Mortician's Tale, Celeste, Super Crush KO, and Parkitect. Currently, I work at Drinkbox Studios, who are the studio behind games like Guacamelee and Severed. We're currently working on a new secret project that we're going to be talking about very soon. And so I work as an artist and UI developer at that studio. That's me.
Who's next? Miriam?
Oh, okay. I guess M is before P.
Yeah.
Okay. So my name's Miriam. I am the head of Bloom Digital Media. We are we call ourselves a boutique game studio, whatever that means. And we have made, our second game just came out on April 16th. It's called Later Daters. You play as a senior citizen dating in an independent living retirement facility. And it is possibly the first senior citizens dating sim out there. We did a lot of market research, and I have to say I did not find anything. So I'm here to talk about why a senior dating sim, and since I am obviously myself not a senior yet, why would that be a personal choice?
Yay. I'm Paloma Dawkins, and I'm a Montreal-based artist, and I make really beautiful games that are often poetic and have experimental kind of backgrounds with like music. And yeah, I'm working on a game right now called Oceanarium, and it's with the Canada Council of the Arts, and that's coming out in July.
Yay! Ooh,
congratulations.
That's incredible. Oh, I think we have so much to share because we all tie in so much of our own kind of way of describing emotions in our games, and like how does our experience impact our current projects. So why don't we actually start with talking about that? How does our experience impact our current project in games? Whether you want me to start off or someone jumps on, happy to.
Why don't you start, Tanya?
Okay, sure, yeah. So for myself, I really started off with actually my background in political science and cinema studies, which sounds so unrelated actually to the field of game development. But after kind of struggling a little bit through political science, a lot of my peers went into law school, and I was like, I'm not sure if that's necessarily my passion. I realized that I really just had a verve for storytelling. And at the time, I thought film industry was really difficult to get into. I thought to myself, you know what, I'm going to get like sleepless hours. I'm not a morning person. I can't deal with shoots like that. But the joke is on me, really, because like long hours is still sometimes, unfortunately, the case in the games industry, whether we run our own studios or otherwise. So for me, some of my experience is also in wanting to tell stories in which I felt I needed as a child. So in that, I really wanted to explore how can we find ways of talking about things like inequality to someone who might not have the language to describe it. I think as a child, I had a really hard time articulating that and finding kind of my own people in which I can discuss that. And I mean that in terms of like folks who would be able to help me understand and witness what's being shown on the news a lot more than necessarily just a very kind of divisive portrayal of society. So I really wanted to explore ways of understanding why certain things are the way that they are. I felt really bad that, for example, I had access to education, a living space, equipment, for example, but there were people around me who didn't, and or even people within or outside of my society who didn't. And I really wanted to understand why. Why is that the case? So I wanted to find ways of creating games or other types of interactive media that explores that. I think the joy in game making is really to find ways of exploring that in a safe environment and to start those conversations and make it interactive so that it's not just one directional as a medium. So that's my joy in discovering games rather than necessarily going the cinematic route.
Very cool.
I feel like I'm still just waking up, so I apologize if I'm rambling. Cut me off, like make some sort of like Oscar like noise or something.
All those canes, just
yeah, exactly.
No, it's great. I like hearing about your history because it's so different from probably the rest of ours. You know, I forget your question, but I think it was about
your experiences.
My experience.
And how does it impact your current projects and games? Current or even previous ones. I think in your case, a lot of that might have to do with the amazing award-winning Mortician's Tale.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I can talk about that a bit. I think a lot of it for me is a lot of my projects, either in games or even just like personal art, have to do with death and grief. That's like a big subject matter that I've always been interested in. I don't look like a goth, but I am like at heart a little bit of a goth.
You have strong goth energy, don't worry.
I do. Goth Sutra wrote an article about me once and they called me goth adjacent, and I was like, that is the most accurate thing that's anyone's ever said about me ever. So as a goth adjacent person, I've always been really interested in death and grief, and that's kind of where the idea of a Mortician's Tale came from. And that's like a big subject matter that I like to explore in a lot of my projects. And so actually that was one of the reasons why I took this job with Drinkbox, is because Severed is such a beautiful game about grief. And so we're working on a new thing now, and it's not really about death, and I can't talk about it too much, but it's really cool to be able to kind of bring some of our own experiences to that. I think as well, a big thing for me is I'm also a queer person. And so bringing my experiences as a queer person to my games is really important and is a thing I've definitely explored through A Mortician's Tale and also Super Crush, especially, which is very gay. And yeah, that's kind of like in summary what I kind of bring to it. I know for Miriam, a lot of your games deal with LGBTQ2IA issues as well.
It's true. That was a nice pass.
I was segue. I was like,
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, similar in a lot of similarities in my story to Tanya's. Like, I think it's whenever I'm in conversations with game people who are like, oh, this was my dream job. I'm like, when I was 12, I wanted to be an architect or an artist or maybe go to space. They had this idea about being the first artist in space. Like, games were nowhere on the horizon for me. So, yeah, I think that I started working in web stuff, and then I started working on games as a sort of a sidebar to my web design career, making Flash games for kids. So I definitely got at games from like a very roundabout place. And why dating sims and why queer friendly dating sims? I think that I identify as queer as well. I think that being queer had a huge impact on my life growing up and on my ability to have healthy relationships with people. And so I think making games that highlight the specificity of different relationships and how important it is that there's not a single narrative for your relationship is probably like the most important part of why my games are about. Our games, I want to say our, it's a company, not just me. Our games are about love, and they're about the specific forms that love can take, because I think that's been missing from the sort of larger narrative. And I think games make it really easy to show that there's a lot of different routes a love can take. I have also been fascinated to watch how love in games has kind of changed over the 5 or 6 years that we've been doing romantic games at Bloom. And that's been really inspiring and really heartening and really lovely to see. Trying to figure out how to frame this. I think it's really interesting, because I think that as love in games gets more and more interest from players, there's this like weird watershed moment where people are going, but can a game just be about relationships? Is it still a game? Why would it be a game if there's not like actually mechanics in it? Like this whole idea of what is a game is no longer just about scoring or about points or about art versus games. It's also about like, what is a playful experience? And I think love in games for me is a place where I did a lot of healing around the idea of relationships, not just being like weird, painful sites of awkwardness.
I love that.
That
That's really
resonates so much.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Yay, games. I've got to come up with my like Paloma.
Your segue, yeah.
From an artsy background, right? Tell us about that.
Love in games, kind of. I don't know. I mean, for me, my my journey in games has kind of like, wait, let me turn up my microphone. I think it's actually all the way. Sorry, I'll just talk louder.
Just talk into the mic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good idea.
You sound great. Yeah.
Yeah, well, okay, so I think my journey starting in games kind of emerged out of I guess kind of an inability to afford like art materials, honestly, and I wanted to have like a place where I could just like infinitely fill a space with stuff and not have to like buy materials. And so I mean, my games kind of like are a museum of like snippets of like feelings and characters that I've met like over my life. And yeah, kind of like my journey to like discover myself. Yeah, I'm like an only child, and so like growing up in Ottawa it was like kind of like lonely, but I kind of like found through games like a community and like a place to express myself and to like find my own personal voice. And yeah.
Yeah, that's so nice. I think that resonates, especially in, today's time. I'm just looking at the comments. Gladius says quarantine love, and
Yes.
perhaps there's something to be said about needing love stories and needing relationships and needing to discover. I think, Miriam, you said different forms and specificities of different kinds of relationships as well. Paloma, you look at like the art of those relationships. It's so beautiful, and it's so poetic and abstract. And Gabby, it's also the love across time in a lifeline of love as well, because you're looking even beyond life and love into death as well. And I think that's really really something unique amongst all of these games, that we share that kind of continuity. Yeah, let's talk a little bit further about that. How has the form of relationships in each of our games changed in terms of in the content? If you wanted to highlight one relationship that you've written in a game and then changed over time, is that something that you want to discuss about? Like from the conception of the, I'm going off script a little bit. That's why everyone's
That's totally
like,
fine. Yeah, I was like,
perplexed expression. I'm so sorry. I can start us off a little bit in terms
Sure.
of like the conception of like writing in Solace State's characters. How at first I thought I'd write about a character a certain way in terms of their relationships. And then because of external forces, or because I had a personal growth, where I hear that being expressed to a few people, including Paloma, that maybe, yeah, that has changed, or has also at the same time stayed the same on different kind of vectors. So for Solace State, I think where the cyberpunk game has stayed the same for me is this idea of like, how can we address social trauma, but at the same time move beyond that in a kind of coming of age of change, personal coming of age. So Chloe, in a way, represents someone who's not radicalized, is not interested in politics at the beginning of the game, but because of her caring for characters around her, she becomes much more embedded to the world. And so you as the player has to make choices in which your game play would impact, like whether or not you get to retain the friendships and intimacy that you want, but also that your reputation in society and how you impact it matters over time. I think I've really experienced a number of challenges writing this because it's very different looking at social division from a textbook and seeing it happen gradually all over the world in the last 3-4 years, and seeing that, and I mean that in different jurisdictions too, from East Asia to the Americas, and seeing an increase of that kind of tension has created some changes in how I write. I'm being very careful with how I speak about this because I know so many people have such vastly different experiences. They have their own specificity, but I think what's underlying it is everyone, what hasn't changed for me in terms of writing is like that hope and respect that everyone actually comes from a similar background, actually. Like everyone just wants to, sorry, maybe background is not the right word, but everyone has a kind of underlying human hope that they have a future that they can look forward to, that they have friends to take care of and care for, the means to care for them. The familial ties and love is still there. And so those relationships in the game still stay. And just to loop it back to my own question, because I think I've neglected it, the relationships that are built in Solace State still configure in a sense of like it's multiple levels of intimacy. So I've really enjoyed writing not just sexual intimacy, but also familial intimacy and love out of duty and honor is something I think isn't often spoken of as much, perhaps in some games. Or outside of maybe like a militarized game where, you know, you're following the troops and maybe that's more duty, but at the same time, it's not like a highlighted element of said game. So different elements of that kind of love is somewhat the same, but also I have to change quite a number of relationships in the game itself to make sure that I really highlight deeper divisions and how can we reconcile that. Yeah, so that's my long-winded answer.
It's very detailed, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting to see kind of how things change as you develop stuff, which is cool. I think for me, the first thing that comes to mind is A Mortician's Tale, which I was the creative director of. It was like my first personal project that I got to work on, like not with other another studio. And a big thing that we changed was originally I had the idea that the game would be about a mortician who attends funerals, and when you talk to the people who are mourning, you have like dialogue trees and you have to like respond a certain way. And we talked about this for a long time, and then after doing a lot of research with funeral directors that we know in real life, we ended up scrapping that whole mechanic completely, because a big part of your relationship with funeral goers as like a funeral director is you're not really there to speak to people. You're there to listen. That is your job, is to just be and listen. And so for us to put this mechanic into this game about running a funeral home that is like, oh, you better say the right thing, otherwise you lose points, it kind of took away from what the game was about. And so that was a big, I guess, like thinking about how relationships have changed and how we've changed things in our games. That was a big one that I can think of, is just like changing that relationship from being talking to and instead just listening was a big thing for us. Yeah.
I do think that in conversational mechanics, there's like a big, I don't know, there's so much about working judgment into conversation in the way that conversational games are designed. And it's really interesting to me, because I think if you're making games about relationships or empathy, then as a design choice, taking as much judgment from speech as possible is kind of a necessity. Because your player will, like, you know, there's the whole choice of games thing. I mean, it's very common now, and you write games with the specific intent to go, okay, well, if this person says this thing, then this rating on their personality should go up. But it assigns so much sort of wizardly power to the game designer to go, well, if somebody says this thing, they must be this kind of personality, but you don't know. Like, someone might choose to say that for a totally different reason. And so one thing, definitely over time, it's become much more clear to me that when we create games that have conversation as the mechanic, that isn't to try to create some sort of meter in speech about how a person should behave. Like, you know, and players are always looking for it. Like, should I say this thing? If I say this thing, am I going to get in trouble for saying this thing? This is the thing I want to say, but I also want this good outcome in the game. So I guess I'll say the smart, nice thing. Like, I've been playing Hi Heaven's Fault. I know you're in the sale. And I've been really enjoying it, but I still find, even though I know that it is my design choice not to try to create situations in which conversation is being ranked, I still read every choice and go, which is the best thing to say for my game outcome, as opposed to like, which one do I want to say in inhabiting in this character? What would I say if this was actually my real life? So we always, design decisions now are about, what do we say, what do we do to make sure that the player is not being punitively treated for saying things that would be true to their experience of this game. Paloma?
For me, the relationships that I want to like focus on is sort of like the player's relationship to the environment, and I try to avoid any kind of like conversation trees, because I want the player to decide who they are in the space, and a lot of the time the characters are just sharing their own experience with the character, with the player, and my hope is that the character will kind of like, or the player will like decide who they are in the space, just by like experiencing it. And another way that I like develop on my characters is like through comics, like outside of the game. Like, I'll kind of like just make a character based on a very flimsy inspiration, like a sketch or a poem, and then later on I'll develop the characters a lot more in like in a comic form, and I'll have them like fall in love with each other or like whatever. And that's kind of like a way for me to build those worlds up.
I do think it's really interesting. I spend a lot of time thinking up histories for the characters that we create at Bloom, which sometimes makes my team a little bit crazy, because I'll show up in a meeting and be like, hey, I figured out what happened with Albert and his spouse. And like, like, oh, really? How did you do that? And I'll be like, well, I was just thinking about Albert and Albert's life and like how they met. And so I do think there's like this emergent quality too. I mean, they're personal games, but like ultimately I'm not thinking about myself very often when I'm thinking about these characters. And I think part of what has allowed them to change is my ability to listen to other people better as I've grown older. So I was going to say, like, there's a thing with queer narratives that it feels like what people are looking for in their queer characters changes over time and shifts kind of with the zeitgeist of like, where are we at? Like, what is the sense of risk? What is the sense of exposure? What is the sense of understanding? And so I'm one type of queer, the type of queer that doesn't visibly present as queer and would never necessarily spark outrage in a public washroom, for example. And then there's other types of queers for whom that is a daily reality and a risk that they face. And so figuring out how to write those characters has been interesting and a huge learning process. And figuring out how to incorporate other people's voices into the process of creation for our games has been hugely beneficial for the company, but means that when I talk about personal writing, I'm really talking about like many other people's personal writing as well as my own, because there's no person who works on our games that doesn't have a personal interest in portraying this world in a way that seems true. So for me as a person, that has been a moment where I've had to learn to grow. Because I think when I was younger, I wouldn't have done this very well. I think I would have been a lot more inclined to argue a point of view rather than understanding that a creative process is a lot more collaborative. And probably like any people who have worked with me in the past are watching and I have made you angry, I apologize. It's been a slow process. And a lot of that has been, I think, part of many people's queer awakenings, is realizing that my queerness is not everyone's queerness.
Yeah,
I really want to add to that as well. I've had a hard time writing Chloe and Rebecca's relationship in the game, whether or not it's really just straight up a mentorship and friendship. What is my kind of conscious like portrayal of that? What if there's any like unresolved tension from a romantic perspective? And because I haven't fully decided on that, it's not something, of course, we can promise or market, but it's something of which I really need to listen to other people about. And this might be exposing a little bit too much about the project, but I think it works so well in the context of this conversation, in which I think Chloe sometimes also as a character, I've talked about this with my own team, she needs to grow up before she's also ready for that kind of arc or awakening of sorts as well. So I can't necessarily just stuff everything under the umbrella of expression necessarily if it doesn't work with the context of the storytelling. So you know, she might explore certain aspects of herself, and then maybe later on, DLC moment, she might explore something else. But it is conversations that we're constantly having, and by having those conversations, I think I agree with you. Like, we have to listen to quite a number of consultants on our team as well regarding that portrayal, and whether or not it's written in at the very beginning and like being consistently examined over time over the course of the writing of the story.
Yeah, I think a big thing too is that like so much of writing queer narrative, you so badly don't want to make it feel ham-fisted or like forced in. Like, you don't want anyone to think that, like, that's something I worry about a lot, especially because I make a lot of short games, is like, I don't want anyone to think that this is a thing that I'm funneling into my game. But it's also hard because as a queer person, I am often like, yes, whenever I see queer media. And so I like want that in my games, but I also want to be very careful to not, I don't know, make it feel like it's tokenizing or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think I'm going to switch gears a little bit, taking a look at the time. We have about 13 minutes left. And I want to ask about like this kind of distinction, maybe it's a distinction, maybe it's not, between our passion and what we're talking about in terms of what we're creating, our passion for our art and game making, versus the more kind of business side or the more administrative elements. Like, how do we balance all of that? How do we keep both the passion alive as well as make sure that we're balancing the need of our kind of administrative unit, our company, our companies.
Does anyone want to start?
This is Miriam's question.
You live in Montreal, isn't that the most passionate city? You
Oh,
should
yeah.
start.
Yeah, honestly, it's a little too passionate sometimes. Like, I find the video game community is like very refreshingly balanced in comparison. Like, Montreal can be very beautiful and expressive, but a little bit of a train wreck. But I get a lot of inspiration from that. I do a lot of like events, like just like weird little like art events here, and I find that it's been like a huge passion fire for me to like have that feedback from like artists and musicians and textile people, and you know, just the huge variety of artists that are here. And then I get to balance that with like the video game community, which I feel is like very it feels like more academic, and I think it's kind of like fitting to be like working in games. I think of business as kind of like a game, and so I kind of get to balance that like passion with games in that way. Yeah, it's been good so far.
Yeah,
Good.
That's so nice. And I think you mentioned before as well that you get inspired a lot from travel. That's been a big part of your process. But then it's like balancing the actual like production work, but also travel. And that's something I think I can relate to. Less travel because I don't do as much travel, but definitely I can relate to because I sometimes bury my head in the sand when I'm doing this one thing administratively. So applications, mostly applications like grant reports, that sort of thing. And like just opportunities to participate at events like this. Thank you, fellow traveler. And biz dev, I do sometimes like focus so much on that I then have a hard time seeing the forest of development, so to speak.
Yeah,
that was a
travel
very
is-
pointed metaphor, but anyways.
yeah, travel is important for me to kind of like get inspiration from, because I mean a lot of my games are like about like basically traveling through like spaces, and so I kind of like need to travel and like kind of like capture like conversations and stuff to like get inspired by. But yeah, it's like hard to balance that with self-care and, you know, just the like solitude that you need in order to create.
Yeah, I find that sometimes if I focus a little bit too much on the administrative side, I end up second guessing my development side a little too much in terms of the writing. It takes me a while to find my tread again to move forward with development, and it takes like a day or two for me to really find my grip and be like, oh yeah, I remember what I want these characters to feel like, not just what they're saying but what they feel like, and keep moving forward, and then also like make good camera positioning and how does the space animate, that sort of thing. It really feels like I'm like two separate people sometimes, and like there's that administrative side where I'm like, I'm really excited to write these application forms. That sounds like a weird thing to say. It seems so dispassionate actually. And then there's the passionate side, which is like, oh, I love the stack of textbooks next to me, but I also need to make it relatable to other people who might not necessarily find philosophy exciting at all. They don't like to read that sort of thing, but they will read something dramatic. So, and then I think about how the characters talk to each other. But yeah, I think it's been kind of an up and down, and sometimes like I do need to like re-engage that kind of momentum for passion, and it takes me like a day or two. And sometimes I just need to talk it out with other developers or adjacent kind of game adjacent folks, creative folks, about like what the heck I'm doing and what I want these characters to sound like. I think a big part of like how do I keep my passion alive is also to talk with consultants as well, or kind of review some of the folks who I've chatted with. So Solace State actually does talk with, over the course of developing Solace State, I've talked to activists and politicians and tried to get a sense of how they speak and how they work and what their hopes are, but also what exhausts them. So it's like reviewing, oh yeah, let's put myself back in those shoes, that I'm able to kind of find that tread again.
Yeah, I think like on the topic of trying to reignite passion after you've been doing a lot of administrative work and like trying to find the balance. Someone said something to me once, and I can't remember what the exact phrasing was, but it was like creative work is very exhausting, and there's a very hard, like you can't put a checklist on a lot of creative work. And a lot of times administrative work just feels so good to get done. And you feel so productive when you like do your accounting or like do some marketing stuff. And so a big thing for me was like trying to find a balance of like, okay, I know that I'm feeling really overwhelmed with all the creative work I'm doing, and that shifting my focus to administrative work will feel really good, but I really need to get this creative work done, and like trying to make sure that I find this balance of like making my actual game, but also like doing the business so that I can stay afloat and like market my game and blah, blah, blah. Like it's a weird balance for sure. And yeah.
I think
Gabby,
that
you're so good at marketing. Sorry, I just had to get that in there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that also, I feel like also it feels like at the right time for me to mention that I'm turning 43 in like 4 days. So
Woo!
I know I'm like
Birthday!
70 in game development. Indie game years, that's like 70. So, and I haven't been doing indie game for the whole time, but I've definitely been doing creative work for a long time. And I think that it's okay for your passions to change too. So I think that has been a big thing for me, is realizing that I'm coming to terms with the fact that I'm a starter, definitely a starter, not really a finisher, hate finishing things, love starting things. So like growing my team to make sure that there's good people who get really excited about the final stages of a project. And there's some people that really love the middle of the project when it's a giant mess and they have to do a lot of work figuring out what we're making, so that I can stay in the happy zone of starting projects. And then once they're started, I can be like, okay, this is what we're doing. And I'm still the producer and I still show up ever so often. And you have to get me as far away from your sprints as possible so that you can actually finish the project. Because I would just keep it going. I would keep starting new parts of this project forever. And that has been really helpful. It's just coming to terms with that fact instead of putting myself in the role of being a person who has to get the project out the door, where I'm a useless tool who no one wants in the room. Like
true.
seriously, I don't know. If you talk to Chris, the project manager, she's like, no, Miriam doesn't help. She should not be in the room when the project is getting done.
Oh, wow.
So that was good. I mean, like I get more disheartened and more frustrated when I can't see a project starting, when I don't see how it's going to start, than I do in the middle of a project. In the middle of a project, I'm just like, oh, whatever, this is boring. I don't want to do that. But I only ever want to like shutter the company and feel like I should stop working if somebody won't let me start something. And by somebody, I mean anything, right? Like, So learning your strengths is also part of keeping the passion alive.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's a great way to, I think, end that portion. We have 5 minutes left. So actually, before we do plugs for each of one of us, I want to ask if you can summarize it into one sentence. What's a philosophical question that drives your game making now? That's hard to summarize that.
No,
I'm so sorry.
No, I have no philosophy. What?
Or emotional journey that you want to drive with your game.
Gay goths. That's my one sentence. There we go. I don't know.
For me, it's taking what you get from the digital natural environment and taking that inspiration to your real natural environment, and kind of like being curious observer in the real world.
It was very
I feel like we
poetic
need that.
compared to
Yeah.
mine. It's beautiful.
I
Yeah,
honestly,
I think
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think mine is recognizing the passion and compassion of diverse groups and finding that middle ground is something that drives the emotion behind my work currently, as well as just the underlying philosophy that I have. That's very tied to both work and personal, I think.
Cool.
Everyone was so like, I thought I like froze or something.
Like,
Did my
I think-
microphone work?
The only thing I could say is that I think that I never know what the rationale behind any of my game decisions are until after the game is done, close to done. It's
I
all,
love that.
yeah.
I
Sorry.
like that. No,
Yeah,
no, you
I
have
know.
nothing to apologize for because I think sometimes we need to explore that a lot. That there are such different avenues of reaching that kind of personal storytelling and emotional storytelling. We could start off with something, it could change, or it could end on something as well. So I think that's really powerful that you showcase that as well and mention that. Okay, so plug, 2-minute warning. Who wants to go first?
I can go first. If you want to
I'll
follow
follow.
more of me, I'm at Gabdar on Twitter, and you can follow along with what we're doing at Drinkbox at drinkboxstudios.com. I'm going to be announcing a new thing pretty soon, and I'm very excited about that.
Ooh.
So see what we're working on. Yeah, that's me.
Cool.
You can follow me on Twitter, or I post way more on Instagram. Both are at Paloma Dawkins. Oh wait, no, actually my Instagram is MissSerious999. Three S's. And yeah, I have a game coming out in July, so please check that out. It's called Oceanarium.
Ooh,
Mm-hmm.
sounds relaxing just by the
Deep
name
sea.
itself. Okay, I'll do the next. Oh, sorry, I keep cutting you off, Miriam. You go ahead. I'll end off.
Later Daters is on Steam right now. It's part of the LudoNarraCon sale, so you can get it this weekend for cheap. It is only part 1. Don't be disappointed when you see the big to be continued at the end of the game. There will be a part 2 coming out soonish, and we also have a special treat in between part 1 and part 2 coming out very soonish.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah, and it's also on Switch. So if you're watching this on Steam but you love Switch, you can get it there too, though no longer on sale.
Twitter?
Oh, Twitter, Bloom_digital_.
Brilliant. And Solace State does not have a release date yet, but our company name is Vivid Foundry. So you can find me on Vivid Foundry on both Instagram as well as Twitter. And you can find the game at solacestategame.com as well as Solace State Game on Twitter. We're also going to be starting more video content soon because I love actually, just chatting with folks. And I think we need a lot more kind of digital content as a whole. So you can find that information that we'll plug on Twitter as well because we're still getting that set up. We also have a Discord channel. Our link will be in the Solace State Game Steam page, and you can find more information there. So yes, and we have a demo for Solace State as well on because of LudoNarraCon happening. So the demo is if you search Solace State in Steam, you'll be able to find that information. I'm also very bad at like remembering all of these social media things. It's just like not my strength. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I'm looking at the chat right now. So many folks have left such nice comments. Thank you so much to Elinari. Crazy Bat Lady says, I'm almost 42, Miriam, and 70 in game dev years. And Voma Scotty said, when we plug stuff, let's write our names in the chat window. And Audrey says, love this last question. Elinari says, again, thank you so much for this panel. And it was so exciting to see this because as someone who uses personal experiences a lot in narrative storytelling, it was so refreshing to hear the different perspectives and thought processes. And I'll Iondra says, wish this panel would never end. So good. Thank you so much.
Aw.
Thanks everybody for watching.
Yeah, thank you. Glad you all enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank
Great
you so
day.
much.
Thank you.
And we'll post all the links.
Yeah.
Woo! There, I did it.